and about the fact potentially we are in a position where there are people who hate this country, who oppose what we are doing and who wants the country to change, and they're out in force on our streets. Anyway, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo is an award-winning historian, author and broadcaster specialising in British national identity, the Anglosphere and culture wars. Oh, Rafe, you sound like my sort of person. So look, why don't you tell us what you think is currently going on in this country and why we're going wrong?
Yes, all right. Well, you're quite right at the beginning there to draw the distinction between immigration and mass migration. I mean, what we had in the 80s and 90s was perfectly fine. We had about 50,000 people coming over here net, which was as perfectly fine for our needs, and also we were able to assimilate and adjust people into our society quite easily. And then back in the 80s and 90s, of course, we weren't obsessed by race. You know, we had Daley Thompson and Tessa Sanderson in the Olympics, Linford Christie, you know, Kenny Lynch. No one thought of those people as being anything other than British. But what's happened is mass immigration has made us all now, along with the long march through the institutions and the woke revolution ushered in by Tony Blair, has made us far more sensitive to race. And of course, the reaction to such large-scale mass immigration is a rising intolerance amongst the indigenous population.
I've noticed that you know, when I grew up, you know, race wasn't the #1 issue. It now really is the #1 issue in this country. I mean, I have to say, it frustrates me enormously that racial tensions that didn't exist in the past are now being created, and I would argue stoked up by the political left, who want people to come to this country, or lots of people to come to this country, in order to denigrate our society.
Yeah.
Well, that's the crux of the issue, actually, and that's the reason why mass immigration first started in Britain. You know, when Tony Blair got that victory in 1997, they thought to themselves, well, the Tories are the natural party of government. We probably only have 2 terms in office in which we can actually implement the radical reform and change that we need to ensure that we have Labour governments in the future.
And change the demographics forever.
And one of the ways we're going to do that is, as Peter Mandelson said, was to send out search parties to bring migrants to Britain, because ethnic minorities vote 80% for the Labour Party. So by allowing mass immigration into Britain, the plan was that over the coming decades, you would have a huge demographic voting for Labour. And if you look at cities like London and in the north, for example, the policy has worked. Because
what I don't understand, Rafe, is we live in a country now where, you know, look, it's not apartheid, but there is no doubt that it is accepted and tolerated to be racist against white people in a way that's not racist. And if you talk to somebody like Lee Jasper, and I advise you not to, but if you talk to somebody like Lee Jasper, what he will say is, racism, the definition of racism is when you are being discriminated on the grounds of your race and your race is in a minority. Right. Now, that is an important caveat, because Lee Jasper, one would assume, believes it's entirely legitimate to discriminate against somebody who's white on the grounds that the king is also white, therefore they won normally.
But of course, we know that that's not true. We know that the most disadvantaged group of all in this country are actually white working class boys. These are the underachievers in society. These are the groups that actually need the help, the helping hand. You know, what we actually have in this reality is, rather than white privilege, we increasingly have a situation of black privilege, where we can see people who are promoted exclusively because of the colour of their skin, rather than actually for any meritocratic purposes.
I mean, I used to get it. I've got to be honest with you. Look, at the end of the day, I'm in a privileged position doing this job. It's a great job. But when I was a contributor, in the same way as Lois and David are, I'll tell you, the number of people that used to phone me up and say, Andre, we love you, we think you're really, really good, but can you find somebody who's as good as you, who's either black or female? And you think, well, you know, I mean, you've just racially discriminated against me and discriminated on the ground. But to make it even more egregious, they asked me to find them. No.
I'll tell you something. Said something, Andrew, that exactly happened to me. When I used to defend smokers, the BBC phoned me up and said, well, we would like to have you on the phone, but you know someone with your similar views who's a woman.
Yeah, and not David Hockney, because wasn't he the pro-smoking thing?
No, tell you what you should have gone. She should have gone, I'm self-defining as a woman.
I wonder, when you talk about the minority thing and the racial thing, whether that particular individual that you mentioned would think that anti-Semitism is okay, though. Because that is a minority,
Yeah,
and that is a racial thing.
So the general. I mean, Rafe, you may know better than me on this, but my basic understanding of the attitude towards Jewish people is, well, they control the media, they control banking, they control business. Ergo, you can discriminate against them, and you're all right. By the way, I will say one thing. Look at the coverage of what took place in Israel and tell me the Jews control the media, because I will tell you it has not gone well. Let's be clear. But on a serious note, look, I was involved in politics in Manchester, and one of the universities, Manchester Metropolitan University, wants to ban a Jewish person from being the anti-racism officer on the grounds that Jews don't suffer racism.
Yeah, okay.
Well, and of course, that's famously what Diane Abbott as well said, right? She said that Jews don't face discrimination like black people do. Completely outrageous statement. And what the left now do, of course, is they view the Jews as being wealthy and therefore being privileged, and therefore they are grouped in with whites, completely ignorant of the fact, of course, that the Holocaust was committed against Jews. Because the Nazis didn't even think
the extraordinary thing is, what's that guy, Lewis Hamilton, is running around saying it's a disgrace that people are profiting from slavery in a Mercedes. I mean, literally.
And a skirt, probably.
There are very few companies in the world that exist today that genuinely profited off slave labour. But I'm afraid the German car manufacturers are some of them.
But, you know, the issue of slavery is really good because it really exposes the true motivations of the race activists and the workerati, because they don't really care about slavery. No. If they were concerned about slavery, they would be picketing the Nigerian and Cameroon and Sudan high commissions and embassies. You know, there are 10 million slaves in bondage in Africa today.
No, it's about the denigration of white.
And you know, Pakistan is the global centre of slavery. And yet our mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who's always proud of the fact that he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver, wants a museum of slavery to be built in London. Yet when he went on an official visit to Pakistan as mayor, not once did he raise the issue of modern slavery in Pakistan. It's all about attacking Britain and the West and trying to tear down what we have in this country, rather than a genuine concern and interest in the plight of real slaves. Because, of course, slaves are
give me 1 second.
300 years ago.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Because we've had loads of callers who are waiting. Let me put through Adam in Hampshire. Adam, you're on Talk TV.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I know there's a lot of talk of the fact that I'm going to start anyway. I know there's a lot of talk about
the problem is, Adam, we're struggling with the line there. Let's go to Callum in Yorkshire. Callum, you're on Talk TV.
Hey up. I think I'm from Yorkshire, and I think one of the biggest problems with migration around here is people with strange accents and strange bow ties, like rich southeast English people, coming up and buying a lot of property and businesses in Yorkshire.
Your points.
And local Yorkshire people are getting bought out by the English immigrants.
I mean,
Yorkshire is in England, isn't it?
No.
Well, some people would disagree. God's own country.
No, I'll tell you one thing, and this is quite an interesting point, because actually communities are being destroyed, and there's two types of people that are a problem. I mean, Callum makes a joke, but it is true that certainly, you know, places, particularly like the Cotswolds, have turned into a museum rather than a working farming community. But the other problem, people, I'm afraid, are people like me, who are internal migrants within the United Kingdom, who go to university aged 18 and never return to the communities that they come from, and most of them end up in the southeast of England. So that does put pressure on, doesn't it, Rafe?
Yeah, but when we're talking about the changes being brought into cities, let's just remember, you know, we're often told by the BBC and the media that there's a rise in anti-Semitism, there's a rise in misogyny, there's a rise in homophobia, yet they never actually call it out. It's the greatest elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Of course, it's mass migration that has made London now the most intolerant city in the country for gay people. Now, for decades, perhaps 100 years, London was the place you would flee to if you were a young gay man. Now, of course, it's the reverse, because you have 52% of Muslims believe that homosexuality should be illegal. It's only 5% in the general public. So when you have such different cultural beliefs and values in Birmingham, in Bradford, in Burnley, and in London, it necessarily creates tensions within the community.
Why can't we turn round and say, look, I'm not being funny and I'm not being critical, but where you come from is a backward dump? I mean, why not? Why not say that?
That's precisely what we should be saying. We should be making a robust defence and promotion of British culture and British values, as we did in the 80s and 90s, having our monoculture being preeminent rather than promoting minority cultures and minority values.
Yeah, if you believe, if you believe in mutti magic, you're an idiot. I mean, that's just, you know, and these areas where they go equal but different. No, if you believe in mutti magic, you're not equal but different. You're believing a load of old hocus pocus, which is actually quite damaging. David.
Yeah, on the positive side, Raf, do you think the Overton window over the last few years or so has shifted to the right?
It has definitely. I mean, I know that, 20 years ago, I dared to link immigration to the housing crisis, and I was shouted down. Oh, my God, you're a racist and a fascist. Of course, now we can finally have that discussion. But the last great taboo, which we aren't yet able to discuss, is the fact that we have cultural practices being practiced in this country which are abhorrent to the West. Acid attacks, gangs with machetes fighting in the streets, honor killings, female genital mutilation. You know, the Metropolitan Police now has a witchcraft training department. Train police officers.
I'll tell you what I find very difficult. When our view of multiculturalism was basically, we turned round to people and said, come to this country, you have a right to come here. If your country, if you have some sort of grievance against Britain, especially come here, because it's your time to stick it back to the British. But the key thing was, it is unpatriotic to be patriotic, was the fundamental message. You must not learn English. You must not assimilate in any way to the United Kingdom. It is the duty of the British people in this country to pander to you, to learn your cultural practices, etc. And that is why you end in a position where you get to a certain percentage of, say, Pakistanis in a particular area, and they say, I'm sorry, this is a Muslim community now, white people are no longer welcome.
No-go areas.
But Andre, you're quite right. But the first issue is the sheer numbers coming over, because it's human nature to ghettoise. You know, when the English are in Dubai or in Spain, they form their own communities. It's human nature. And when you have such vast numbers coming over, there's no incentive for them to assimilate because they have everything where they are. Let me put it this way. We've had more immigration in the past 2 decades than in the past 2,000 years combined.
Wow.
Last year, we had more immigration than the entire decade of the 1990s. And we know there are 10 million foreign-born people in this country. 4 million of them arrived in the last decade.
Well, of course, there is another point here. There's another point here. I think isn't it something like 30 or 40% of new, what we would call NI numbers, issued in the past 15 years in the Republic of Ireland are for people who are not born in the Republic of Ireland. Now, I would suggest to you that the Republic of Ireland population has not increased by 30 or 40%. What has happened is they've registered in Ireland and moved to Britain.
I'm absolutely convinced about that. But also, you have to remember, all of this has happened without the British people ever getting a vote.
We were never asked. We were never asked about it.
It's the single most important event ever to have affected this island. It's so much more profound than Brexit or the EU, and yet for a quarter of a century, our elected officials have allowed it to continue, even though they've been voted in to do just the opposite. That nothing has been more damaging to our nation than in mass immigration, and I mean in the last 2,000 years, more damaging than the Second World War.
Well, very, very briefly, Raf, I've traced back the opinion polls back to the 1950s on immigration. Every single one is about the same. 66% of people, 72%, 75% of people consistently over the last 50 years have asked for less immigration. And, and when...
nobody cares what they think.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
and Reed Powell's River of Blood speech, there were 2 polls done at the time. One has 74% approval, and the other one was 68%.
Well, you could go back even further than that. I'm Tudor fanatic, and they were complaining about foreign workers in the Tudor period as well. But of course, there was no mass immigration then.
I was reading Samuel Pepys, who got into trouble because he used a builder who was a foreigner, and the definition of foreigner was from Essex.
Oh no, am I a foreigner?
Well, it's funny because the Tudors actually were very xenophobic, right? English people used to be terribly xenophobic in the Stuart and Tudor and Victorian era. The great contrast is that today, English people, British people are amongst the top 3 most tolerant nations in the world, and yet all we get from the media is that we are somehow a racist nation.
There's a woke agenda.
back in the Tudor times, that would have been the case.
But we've successfully. But people
today we every there's something called the World Values Survey, which every year goes to every country in the world and asks people, how would you feel if somebody of a different race moved in next door to you? The most racist places are in India, Asia, and Africa.
Oh, I heard it before. I had a friend who dated an Indian girl, and they went, oh, unfortunately, her mum and dad are very unhappy about her dating a white person. And I said, can you imagine if his mum turned around and went, I'm very concerned about my son dating an Asian?
Well, very quickly.
Out.
Do you remember a couple of weeks when I was on the show, that person right at the end of the evening said, I bet you wouldn't talk about Charlene Downs and Chris Donald. Chris Donald was a Scottish guy who was murdered by 5 Asians. And the reason they went after him because he dared to speak to a Muslim girl his own age. He was 15.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrible.